Okay, so the state of nature is that state in which there is no government authority. There's no authority higher than the individual, no authority over the individual. And it seems like, at least on one way, a popular way in the early modern period, that is the Enlightenment period of thinking about this, political authority is defined in terms of the state of nature, in the sense that what makes a government legitimate depends on what people would agree to if they had no government. What kind of a government would they agree to? This is a basic principle that we generally follow. We enshrine consent in every way. Am I owed money? Well, what were the terms of the agreement? What does he get in the divorce? Well, what were the terms of a prenuptial agreement? Was there a violation of this person? Well, was the thing that happened agreed to, etc.? Consent is enshrined, and this was a kind of a new way of thinking about this in the Enlightenment period. It wasn't very common when Enlightenment thinkers started talking about this, and now it's become commonplace that, of course, a government is not legitimate, at least at some level, without the consent of the governed. It might be at a basic level, right? In the case of the U.S. government and the U.S. Constitution, there was at some point some agreement on the Constitution. Not everybody agrees with everything that comes out of, for example, the House of Representatives or the legislative branch in general, or the government in general. But the point is, you could make an argument that we've all agreed to the basic premise of American democracy, that this is the way the government works. At least, a lot of people want to say that, and that's why it is a legitimate government. On the other hand, in the case of the 18th century American rebellion against a British government, it was on the basis of this is a violation of something that was consented to. This is a violation of basic natural rights. So, the state of nature is a natural way of talking about political authority. What are the conditions under which we would agree to a government? That tells you what a legitimate government looks like. Would we agree to a government that can kill people at will? Well, is that better than the state of nature? Would we have agreed to that if we didn't have a government? Answer to that is going to tell you whether the government that kills people at random is a legitimate government. All right, let's talk about Locke. We saw that Hobbes has a nasty picture of the state of nature, and on the basis of that, concludes that government basically has can basically do whatever it wants to its citizens, because they would have had to have agreed to like carte blanche, unconditional surrender to a sovereign, to a government. Locke does not have that picture. Locke does not have that picture of the state of nature, and therefore for Locke, the bar is higher for what it takes to be a legitimate government. And like I've said before, it is on the basis of Lockean thinking that you get the American Revolution. Without Locke, I mean, this is a complicated historical claim, but you could definitely make a case that without Locke, you wouldn't have gotten America. Because you wouldn't have had this idea that actually, no, a government has to respect people's basic inalienable natural rights in order to be legitimate. And then without that thought, you wouldn't have gotten the Declaration of Independence. You violated our rights. You're not respecting the rights that a government has an obligation to respect. We take that to be self-evident. We take that to be obvious. It wasn't obvious in the 18th century, or at least in the 17th century. Okay. Let's talk about Locke. So for Locke, Locke agrees with Hobbes. He thinks that the natural state of humans is the state of nature, and he agrees that governments are legitimate insofar as people make some sort of agreement or contract. He agrees that you determine what the extent of government authority by appeal to what the state of nature is like, because that's where you tell what people would have agreed to. Is this, if the worse the state of nature is, the more carte blanche they would make their agreement with a potential government. Where he disagrees with Hobbes, and where you're going to get a divergence, is that Locke thinks that there are natural rights. Again, like everything you say about Locke, for the most part, At least students in America are going to be like, yeah, I mean, obviously. And maybe that's because he's right. Maybe that's because he's obviously right. And at least part of it is going to be too because that's the person who happened to influence our system. Of course, yeah. I mean, we agree with Locke. Locke is kind of the foundation of our political system. So Hobbes doesn't think that he doesn't really think that there are natural rights. It's a little bit more complex than that, but basically he doesn't. Locke thinks there are rights that people have even in the state of nature. Your rights were given to you by God, Locke thinks. They can't be taken away from you because there's no government. Governments can maybe grant people superficial rights, but governments are not the grantors or the guarantors of our natural rights. We have those no matter what. And if you don't believe that, then it doesn't seem like governments can really violate rights. If a government, if you think the government is where you get all your rights, if it's in a certain political system that any sort of rights make sense, then like as soon as your government says, okay, you have no rights, well then you have no rights. It's only on the assumption that there are things like natural rights you're born with, that they're inalienable, that make it the case that you can say the government has violated my rights, even though the government does, almost especially in a case where there's a government that doesn't recognize your rights. For Hobbes, nothing in the state of nature is unjust. He's very clear about that. For Locke, there can be wrongs done to you in the state of nature. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a way of redressing those wrongs or punishing the wrongdoer, but it's still wrong. So rights are not granted or endowed by government for Locke. And what that means, just to make this brief and make it quick to the point, for Locke, proper government is a more limited government. Now, this is not like we're not full-on libertarians yet. I mean more limited than limitless, essentially. For Hobbes, because the state of nature is so horrible, we have to make an unconditional surrender to the sovereign, which means government can do whatever it wants. But if you come in thinking, no, there are rights that people have, and they have them regardless of anything, then our agreement is going to be more limited. Okay, let's talk about why Locke thinks that you have natural rights. He gives a couple different arguments for that, but arguably his best argument is the divine argument, that or the argument from I guess that God endowed us with those rights. So for Locke, that right, it's not exactly the kind of argument you might be imagining. It's not like God, speaks and we suddenly have rights. For Locke, it actually goes back to property. So famously, Thomas Jefferson kind of, I don't want to say stole, but was inspired by Locke when he wrote that we have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He's 2 out of 3 in terms of quotation of Locke. Locke said that our inalienable rights are life, liberty, and property. Property is a really important natural right for Locke, and he has an entire theory about how we gain property and how we transfer property. So if you acquire a natural resource, so let's say I chop down a tree, I process the wood, I turn it into a bench. For Locke, that's now my property, as long as no one owned the tree in the first place. So again, I'm assuming you come onto virgin soil, no one has a claim to that tree. I chop it down, I build a bench out of it. It's my property because I've mixed my labor with it, on Locke's view. So it's the mixture of my labor with the natural resource that makes it my property. And then I can transfer it by consent to other people. So this is how all property ownership and property transfer works for Locke. So Locke is big on property. It's a natural right. And it's also the foundation of his argument for our natural rights. We are God's property, on Locke's view, because he made us. In the same way that the bench is my property because I made it, I mixed my labor with it. Similarly, go back to Genesis. How did God make people? Well, at least in one of the chapter 2, I believe, of Genesis, God takes some dirt and smushes a man together and breathes life into him. He works, he labors to make humanity, and therefore humanity is God's property. No one has a right to destroy anybody else's property without that person's consent. I made the bench. You can't come along and hack it to pieces unless I say hack it to pieces, or you can hack it to pieces if you want. So for Locke, murder, I have a right to my life. I have a right not to be murdered because I am the property of a divine being, that is God, and God is not allowing me, God has not consented for you to kill me. Therefore, it would be wrong. I have a right not to be murdered. That's a sort of strange argument, and it actually seems to maybe not do all of what Locke wanted it to do. Because what we want is for me to have a right not to be murdered. It's my right. It's inherent to me. It can't be taken away from me. But it seems like all he's done with that argument is shown that God has a right to not have his property destroyed. It's not the property's right to not be destroyed. What I want is for it to be each human individual's right not to be murdered. Now, but you could imagine a similar argument. Maybe God just grants people rights. And that would make sense of why people, absent any government, would have the right to life, liberty, and property. God decreed it. He's a divine lawmaker. He said that people have these rights, and therefore they have these rights. That's another sort of Locke-inspired argument that you could make for natural rights. And it's the kind of argument a lot of people have made. Okay, so on a Lockean view, you have natural rights. You have them independently of governments. And because you have those rights, government authority is actually more limited. They can do lots of things, but they can't violate your natural rights. And in fact, Locke says if they do violate your natural rights, if they are killing their citizens without good cause, if they are taking away their citizens' property in ways that hasn't been consented to, etc., if they are limiting their citizens' liberty in certain horrible ways, then he actually says you have the right to rebel. And this was a radical claim at the time. And without that radical claim and claims like it, you, again, arguably wouldn't have, I wouldn't be sitting here in this backyard. There wouldn't be a nation of America. Okay, let's spend the last few minutes talking about one little problem with the whole framework that we are talking within. That is the state of nature framework. The assumption of both Hobbes and Locke was that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. That's the assumption, because the assumption is, well, if you can figure out what the state of nature is like, and therefore what people would agree to get out of the state of nature, then you've discovered what the proper extent of government is, because it's whatever people would agree to. But here's the problem. If you might argue, well, okay, the state of nature has never existed, or at least we have no evidence that it existed in all cases where there's a government. And even if it did exist, that means like a few people way back in the day consented in some way, but no one since living in these nations, in any modern nation, has consented to the government that they're living under. I haven't consented to living in America. You haven't consented to living in America, to living under the American system. 250 years ago, a system was built, and we are living under it in some sense against our will, or at least not explicitly by our consent. So in what sense can you say that government authority is by consent? There's no person living today who agreed to the original American agreement. And we're a young nation. We're a young government. So how much more is that going to be true in much older political systems? So here is the one potential way out, and it's the path of tacit consent. Tacit as opposed to explicit. Explicit consent is where you say, I agree to this. You make some very clear statement that you agree, that you consent to something. Tacit consent, you can argue that something has been tacitly consented to, if they didn't explicitly agree to it, but they can be assumed to agree to it for whatever reason. If like maybe imagine there's a lawsuit, someone threw up on a ride at Six Flags, and let's say they sue Six Flags over it. Well, the court might reasonably say, well, let's say that the basis of their lawsuit is I never signed a waiver that said I was willing to go on a ride even at the expense of my own intestinal quietude, even at the expense of having to throw up. I never wrote that. I never signed it, and I never even said it verbally. I never told anybody I was willing to do that. So I didn't consent to it. You have a ride that made me throw up, so you violated my rights. I didn't consent to that. Well, the judge is probably going to laugh. It's probably not going to make it that far. It's probably going to be dismissed out of hand. It will never make it to court. But the reason it won't make it to court is because you tacitly consented to that. Everybody knows, any reasonable person knows that is what Six Flags is about. It's roller coasters, it's rides, and anybody who didn't know that when they got there could look at the thing, and knowing anything about the human body and their own experience in the world would know that there's a chance they might throw up on that ride. So you could be argued to have tacitly, implicitly consented to the possibility of throwing up on that ride. So you can't sue Six Flags. You could argue, if you're Locke, if you're Hobbes, if you are a social contract theorist in general or a state of nature theorist, that people are tacitly consenting to live under at least democratic governments where they, and that's an important qualification. Why are they tacitly consenting? Well, they're not leaving, you might argue. They're living there. They're enjoying the goods of this society, of this government. They are calling the police when someone tries to break into their house. They're relying on the goods, the benefits of having that government. They fall back on welfare they fall back on disability when they are disabled at their job. If they're unemployed, if they get fired, they use unemployment. If you are using the benefit provided by a system, you might be saying, it could be argued that you are implicitly agreeing to the features of that system. Just like if you get on the ride intentionally at Six Flags, it might be argued you are agreeing to the features of that ride, the natural consequences of that ride. Now, does that work? Let me just note one problem with that argument. Locke does this. He thinks that you're accepting the benefits of the system. You're tacitly agreeing to live under the system. Does it work? Well, what makes it different from the Six Flags case is this. In the Six Flags case, you could have done something different. You could have not gotten on the ride. And that's a core feature of the argument that you tacitly consented. You got on the ride. No one forced you onto the ride. You had the option to walk away from the ride or even not even enter the park or leave the park after you see that that's the kind of things they do here. Is that always true? Is that always true for political systems? Does anyone pick any random American? Is it clear that they have the option not to use or benefit from the features of the American system? Sometimes, like you could, I guess, you could choose not to go to public parks. That's one thing you could do. You're not going to use that benefit, but that's optional, right? Maybe could you choose not to use the road system that have been built by the government? Maybe you could stay in your house, but how are you going to get food? If you're gonna order it to your door, you're using the roads. You're using the roads. Now, so it seems like there's really no way to live here without enjoying, or at least using the benefits provided by our government. And that makes it different. Makes it seem not as clear of a case that you're tacitly consenting to it. Now, you could argue, well, you always have the option to go somewhere else. always have the option to go somewhere else. Just like you could leave the theme park, you could not get on the ride, you could move to a different country. But even that's not perfect. It's true, and it for those people who have that option, you could maybe make that argument, but not everybody has that option. So not everybody is in a position to leave the country. And that means it's hard to make the case for everybody, at least, and for a huge number of people at least, that that they've tacitly consented to being here or anywhere, in any country. It's all, you're going to have the same problem anywhere. I don't think there's a single country in the world where everybody has the ability to leave at any point, could just pick up and move. Everybody in the country. There will always be some people in any country who could do that, but is it going to be true for everybody? And we don't want to say that, well, the law only applies, the government only has authority over the people who could leave but choose not to because they've consented to it. We want to say, no, even if you can't leave, you still have to follow the laws. And that makes it a harder thing to say, that government is only legitimate if it's consented to. Now, maybe the state of nature people don't have to say that. Maybe they think it's legitimate if it was consented to by somebody in the past, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you could make that case. But this is a complicating feature of all state of nature or social contract theories in general, as these things are called. That's where we'll stop.